All right. Thanks a lot to everyone for sticking around. We've got a great second panel here. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Kyle Kondik. I'm the Communications Director at the Center for Politics. I also work with Professor Sabato on the Crystal Ball. And I also want to point out the other member of our team, Jeff Skelly, who's walking around the back, and Tim Robinson, who are also very helpful to putting out the Crystal Ball, which I hope you all receive. And if you don't receive it, you can sign up for it by the table. So in this panel, we're going to try to look ahead a little bit to maybe what America's near-term political future might look like. And we've got a great panel here. So let me introduce everyone. Directly to my left is Sean Trende, who is a senior elections analyst for Real Clear Politics, works with Carl Cannon. And he's also the co-author of the upcoming 2014 Almanac of American Politics. Political geeks know that that's kind of the Bible, the new Bible that comes out every 2 years about American politics. He is also a contributor to the Center for Politics' upcoming post-election book, which is titled Barack Obama and the New America, 2012 Election and the Changing Face of Politics. I would say it's a great Christmas gift, to steal my boss's line, but it's not actually coming out for Christmas, but it'll be out in January. But you can pre-order it. The link to it will be in the Crystal Ball tomorrow, which you could sign up for. So it's all very convenient. Next is Jamal Simmons. He's a principal at the Rabin Group, which is a Washington, D.C. consulting firm. During the 2010 congressional elections, he was the Democratic political analyst for CBS News, and he also is a frequent contributor to CNN and MSNBC. He has also served as a senior aide to several Democratic political campaigns, including as a communications advisor to the Democratic National Committee during the 2008 presidential election. Next is Jim Perry. He served as Deputy Chief of Staff and Director of Policy for one of the nation's most prominent Republicans, former Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour. More recently, Jim served as a debate advisor for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, and he also is a former student of my boss, Larry Sabato, here at U.Va. Next, we have Kellyanne Conway. She is a Republican strategist and pollster and president and CEO of the polling company Inc. / WomanTrend. During her career, she has worked with the late Congressman Jack Kemp, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, former Vice President Dan Quayle, and the new Governor of Indiana, Mike Pence. And finally, we have John Martin, who is a senior reporter at Politico, where he covers national politics. He previously wrote for National Review and National Journal's Hotline. And he also is a graduate, and these are his words, he's a graduate of the all-boys school down the road, Hampton, Sydney. So I'm from Ohio, and so sometimes I mess up these Virginia terms, particularly the name of Virgil Good, who I once called Virgil Good and sort of sounded stupid. So I wanted to start, and I wanted to pick up from something that Mark Mellman was talking about in the last panel, and that is to sort of talk about the fundamentals of the election. And one fundamental in particular, and that is that usually, at least in modern times, a president running for his party's second party term, meaning that when he took office, he took power from the other party, they almost always win. The only exception was Jimmy Carter in 1980, who had taken over from Gerald Ford in 1976. And one of the reasons why Carter lost is because, as bad as the economy was this time around, it was far worse in Carter's reelection bid. Just to use one statistic, second quarter gross domestic product growth in the second quarter of this year was 1.3%, which is relatively anemic. Well, for Carter, it was negative 7.9%, which is incredibly bad. And so there were a lot of unique circumstances that led to Carter's loss. And just with that one fundamental in mind, I wanted to just ask the panel, and anybody can chime in on this. We talk about, do the Republicans need to change their party? Do they need to dramatically reshape themselves? And you could argue, and the panelists may agree or disagree with this, that one single factor probably made Obama a favorite, and then after the second party term of Obama is over, maybe the Republicans just structurally become kind of a favorite, and it's that simple. So I just wanted to ask the panel if they agree with that, and if they see that the Republican Party really needs to change, or are we just in this sort of, may the pendulum just naturally swing back to the Republicans 4 years from now?
Well, I think a lot of things obviously depend on the playing field in the economy. I mean, if we're going into a recession in 2015 or 2016, and the business cycle tends to be 6 to 8 years, so we're actually due about then, which is scary because we haven't even recovered from the last one yet. But, regardless of demographic shifts and other things that I think people are basically familiar with the storyline, it's going to be tough for Democrats to win. The political science models based on the economy were predicting on average that Obama would win by a point. He won by 3. That's well within the error margins of these things. And so we see an election that really does look like what the fundamentals would predict. It's an economy kind of like 2004 or 1960 where things are, just not going great but not terribly. Those produce close elections. I think kind of the question, the billion-dollar question, since these are billion-dollar elections now, is what we saw this year in terms of demographics the Obama coalition, or is it the new Democratic coalition? I think you can argue it either way. You can certainly argue that Obama has energized voters that were previously disengaged from the political process twice now, and once people have voted twice, they're no longer occasional voters; they're regular voters. But the flip side is that in 2009, 2008 and 2012 happened, and they're important data points. But 2009 and 2010 and 2011 happened as well. And, the Democrats tried very, very hard to turn a lot of the 2008 voters out in those years and failed miserably. And so the question is, when Obama is off the ticket, when you have someone like Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton on top of the ticket, can these voters be energized again? And like I said, I think it's a question you can argue either way. I'm a little skeptical. I'm probably like 51, 52% can't do it. But, I think that is the overarching question to address.
I think that if you had, it's funny, this has been my 6th, I think, presidential campaign, starting with Bill Clinton in 1992, and there's always some kind of historical marker that people come up with, a predictor that says this is the reason why the election is going to work out this way, or this is why it's going to work out the other way. If that was the case, we should just all line up the historical markers and save the $1 billion and just have, pick one of the people who's supposed to happen based on the trend line. But they're always something. Everything is true until it's not true. There was never going to be an African American president until we had an African American president, or you couldn't get elected with the unemployment rate above 7.4% until you got reelected with an unemployment rate at 7.8 or 7.9%. So, as a practitioner of the arts of politics, I always take those things with a little bit of a grain of salt. When you talk about the coalition that the president put together, there's a fundamental thing that I particularly want Democrats to know, that you cannot, and I think we saw this in 2010, to get to Sean's point, you can't immediately transfer loyalty from one candidate to another just based on, party identification. I mean, ask Bill Clinton, who was incredibly popular with African American voters, if he was able to transfer the loyalty to Bill Clinton to Hillary Clinton when she ran against Barack Obama in 2007 and 2008. These voters, these candidates, need to have individual relationships with these voters. They need to create a rapport, have an issue palette that creates a relationship with African Americans, with Latinos, with white working class union voters, with women, the urban voters. They have to have individual relationships. And so I think for Democrats to think that we have now struck upon this demographic nirvana, and all we have to do is ride this wave to victory for the next 10 or 15 years until the Republicans get their act together, I think we'll end up woefully disappointed.
Yes. In 2004, I actually came to this conference with my former boss, Governor Barbour, and this was when Bush had just won what was a very close election against Senator Kerry. And he said what he often said in politics, things are never as good as they seem, and they're never as bad as they seem. And I think somebody said on the panel earlier, in 2004, there was this big question as to whether or not the Democratic Party needed to make some sort of radical adjustment. And 2 years later, they took over the Congress, and 2 years after that, they elected President Obama. I think that we got to be careful that we don't take too much of a lesson from elections. I mean, each one of them are discrete, things, and we have a tendency to think that, well, the winning campaign must have done everything right, and the losing campaign must have done everything wrong, and boy, those people are idiots. Well, a lot of the same people that were involved in the Bush campaign in 2000 were involved in the Romney campaign in 2008, and they didn't become idiots overnight. I mean, there is a foundation for which the Republicans have a good opportunity to do good things in the future. Do they need to make some changes? Yes, and so do the Democrats. I mean, the amazing thing is that President Obama took what was once seen as a weakness, that is that the Democratic Party was dependent upon a coalition of minorities and somewhat disparate interest of labor and environmentalists or what have you. He actually turned it into a big strength in that he invigorated those broad coalitions and won, and he deserves an enormous amount of credit for that. I think the thing about Governor Romney, a little Freudian slip there, wishful thinking. The thing about Governor,
it's okay, it goes away with time.
Exactly. I'm still in mourning. The thing about Governor Romney's results is that there are actually some interesting things that are signs for hope if you're like I am and you're desperately searching for signs for hope. That he won the middle class. This is the first time in recent memory that the person who got elected president lost the middle class. The only income group that President Obama won was people under $50,000. So if you consider, it's interesting, both Obama and Romney, for tax purposes, define the middle class as people who make less than $250,000, but that's a generous middle class. But for if you take a socioeconomic definition of 50 to 100,000 being the middle class, Romney won that. That's a pretty good foundation moving forward. That's not to say that there's not massive lessons that the Republicans need to take in terms of immigration, Hispanics, et cetera, African Americans. But I think that the likelihood that 4 years from now we're going to be talking about how in the world can the Democrats try to replicate the magic of Barack Obama, it's a pretty good chance. I think that we just got to make sure that we don't read too much into the results.
Thank you very much for having me here, Larry and Glenn and everyone else. Really appreciate being here with these gentlemen. The fundamentals of the race never really changed as far as I saw them. The incumbent had significant advantages that many incumbents have. He had some disadvantages, but they were all hiding in plain sight. A poor economy, a less enthusiasm among rank-and-file voters who supported him in 2008, a little bit of a hangover from 2010, meaning Obama himself was not on the ballot in 2010, but his agenda certainly was, because the Republicans had a big sweep based on those who voted for or against the bailouts, the stimulus, the spending, and of course the crown jewel, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And it's funny that Obama has proven the thing that the Republicans did get right about Obama was true, but it just also wasn't enough. He actually did have a high unemployment rate. People were less enthusiastic about him. His crowds were smaller. He himself seemed a little less optimistic and hopeful and had joy on the job than the guy you saw in 2008. He did have a smaller percentage of the vote among young people, from 66% to 60%. He actually had a smaller percentage of the female vote. For all the talk of the gender gap, he went down 2 points, which was a total blow of historical trends, where the three successfully reelected presidents in the last 30 years, Reagan, Clinton, and George W. Bush, had all improved their margins from the first election to reelection among women by 7 to 8 points. He actually went down 2 points. And he actually went down 2.5 points among African Americans. But you know what? It also didn't matter, because you can actually decrease your take among these key groups and still win. And so I think the misperception on the Republican side may have been all of the fundamentals are working against him. That was true. But it's not enough to deny him a second term. And the other reason that happened, frankly, is because I don't know a billion things in this world, but I know voters, and I can tell you that voters love to talk about change and choice and options and revolution, and they go to McDonald's every night in the minivan and order number 3. We've made it so easy to be creatures of habits. You don't even have to articulate the kind of sandwich, just the size of the fries. Hey, should we try Burger King tonight? No way, man. So we stick with what we know, unless and until we're given a compelling reason to do otherwise. And the compelling reason simply wasn't there. And I actually believe, and here I credit voters tremendously. I actually have a lot more faith in voters than the political class does, by and large, because I spend a great deal of time with them. And some of the smartest things I've ever heard have come from, we the people. One thing that was very clear is that at a time of great uncertainty, gas prices rising, terrorism, hurricanes, we're waiting for the locusts to come next. There's so much uncertainty and lack of control all around us that if we can keep in place one or two fundamental things and people and structures, we're going to do it. And that also is a pro-incumbency that benefited George W. Bush in 2004. It was over 3 years since 9/11 had happened, but it was the first post-9/11 presidential election, and clearly terrorism and the wars were still top of mind to people. The other thing is about 4% of voters were truly persuadable in the last couple of weeks. In our post-election poll, 39% of actual voters said they had made up their mind long before, before the summer. An additional 15% said that they always vote. 9% say I always vote for the Democrat, so my mind was made up. 6% said I always vote for the Republican. You're at 54% before the conventions even start, before Ryan is selected, before the debates. So there was a very small percentage of persuadable voters. And then the other thing is, I actually think that Governor Romney ran a much better campaign than he's given credit for. I think it was much closer than people thought it should be. But I will say
the campaign
that
was fine. It was Romney that I think people didn't like.
Pardon me?
But the campaign was fine. I think it was Romney that people didn't like.
And what I was going to say is, it's not just likability, Jamal. I think that that's overblown in politics. Of course, people want to like their president. They want to like their leaders. But more important than the question of do I like you is, are you like me? That's really the question voters are most interested in. The do I like you is a living room test. I mean, frankly, it was Bill Clinton, because that was really the age of TV and multimedia, even more so than when Reagan was president. Bill Clinton really institutionalized the do you like me component of presidential politics, where you turn on the TV and you say, I want that guy for the next 4 or 8 years, and he's accessible, he's affable. And I think, frankly, institutionalizing it hurt his own vice president, Al Gore, and hurt his own wife, Hillary Clinton, when they went to run for president, because they never scored as highly on the do I like you metric. But the more important question is, are you like me? People want that connective tissue. And I believe that Governor Romney never actually overcame his, what I would call his wealth disadvantage in terms of showing how he connect with you. Now, Ross Perot was worth 4 times the amount of money as Mitt Romney. Public records would show, but he somehow convinced 1 in 5 voters in this country that he was just like them. And so the connective tissue. It was his charts. He's a graph. But I think Governor Romney had so many different ways to connect with American people. He's buried both of his parents. That had to be hard. They've raised 5 children together. I mean, he's got connective tissues with the average American that I'm not sure he was ever, really willing to reveal. But are you like me, in my view, is the big question for the Republican Party in moving forward. And the last thing I'll say is the worst question the Republican Party can continue to ask, and it's killing them, is can he win? Can she win? Or in the reverse, she can't win, he can't win. Who says? It is so ridiculous to rob voters their right to choose their nominees at any level of the political process. And for all the talk of Aiken and Murdoch, let's not let off the hook 5 or 6 of the hand-picked Republican Senate candidates who lost miserably. Heather Wilson, Rick Berg, the guy up in Montana, North Dakota. Thank you, Tommy. Well, yeah, and Josh Mandel, Connie Mack. So this idea of picking the winners and losers beforehand, particularly the presidential level, who can win? How do you know who can win? We were told the last 2 presidential elections, these 2 people can win, and they didn't. So I'm all for the voters deciding who can win. Voters don't ask themselves who can win, they ask themselves who can lead, and it's a very different definition.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Larry and Kyle and Ken for having me here. It's always fun to be in Charlottesville, and Larry has put together a great Center for Politics. Talent, perhaps not since Jefferson dined alone, has been over there at the Center for Politics. So thanks so much for having me here. I'll talk about the future mostly, but let me just make one comment on the past. There's so much talk about, Obama did poorly according to this exit poll and that exit poll, and his numbers were, down among women and this group and that group. It's important to keep in mind the context in which we're talking about that. The 2008 campaign was unique. Everything was going against the Republicans. It was an historical year. George Bush was so unpopular. John McCain scared off a lot of independent voters when he put Sarah Palin on the ticket. And Barack Obama was an historical figure who attracted a lot of people who otherwise I don't think would ever vote for a Democrat. So, yeah, he didn't do as well as he did in 2008, but that's in part because 2008 was so damn unique unto itself. In terms of the future, can the Obama coalition survive? Well, George H.W. Bush won Reagan's third term, and he wasn't Ronald Reagan, as we know. The answer is, if the sort of tectonic shift has happened, it is possible for somebody else to win Obama's third term. The key question to me is, who is that person? Well, can Martin O'Malley or John Hickenlooper put together the Obama coalition? Could be a challenge. Could Hillary Clinton do it? Absolutely. In fact, I think if Obama has an economic recovery in the second term and Hillary is the nominee, I think it's possible that the GOP could be shut out of the White House for 10 more years. Because if you think about it, Hillary Clinton could replicate parts of the Obama coalition. It could make up for what she lacks with a stronger turnout among women and blue-collar whites. So I think Hillary could be very formidable. Now, look, if they can't get Hillary, I think it's a very different ball game, and I think Sean probably is right that it does get harder to replicate the Obama coalition. But keep in mind the demographic trends of the country are not going to suddenly reverse, and the 2016 share of the white vote is going to be less than the share of the white vote this time around. Just as this time around, it was more than it was. Less than it was 4 years before. So that's not going to change either. To me, what is crucial here is, does Hillary run for the Democrats? A, and then beyond that, do the Republicans learn from what happened in 2012? If they take the advice from the Jim Perrys of the world and the Haley Barbours of the world, and they do accommodate on immigration, then I think they could be right back in there in 2016. But you have to sort of learn from the past. Democrats took 3 cycles, Larry, before they finally realized, okay, we've got to do something on national security, on welfare reform, on trade. And the guy from Hope, led them back to the promised land, was helped by Ross Perot, certainly. But it took them three cycles. It's now been 2 cycles for the Republicans. They're willing to make a move on immigration, but that's not going to come without some serious pushback from the party base. So what I'm watching for in the future is, can the Obama coalition survive with a non-Hillary nominee, A, and B, what lessons did the Republicans learn from 12? And did they take those lessons and apply them in terms of legislation and position for the next 2 or 3 years? And I think if they do, they'll be back in the game in 2016.
John brings up the man from Hope, and what's interesting to note about Bill Clinton is that after the 1988 presidential election, the Democrats found themselves in a position very similar to the Republicans now, and that is that after Michael Dukakis lost in 1988, Democrats had lost 5 of 6 presidential elections. Now we're in a position where Democrats have at least won a plurality of the popular vote in 5 of the 6 elections. Of course, Gore lost the presidency in 2000. And I wonder if anyone would like to think about, do the Republicans need a Bill Clinton? And if so, maybe who might that person be? And, Bill Clinton was sort of a kind of the third way, sort of moderate Democrat. At least that's the way that he presented himself. And so I'm wondering, is that a person the Republicans maybe need, and maybe who might that be?
If I can jump in for a second. I think going to answer that question, but also to follow up with something that Jonathan said, I don't think it's something that one person can fix in terms of the immigration side of things, because I don't think that immigration, I think somebody said this on the earlier panel, immigration is not a cure-all. Right. It's not that you can't, if all of a sudden John Boehner comes out and says we're going to have a markup of a bill that has a comprehensive immigration reform, we're certainly not going to go back to getting the 40 to 45% of the Hispanic vote that George W. Bush got. But it's a gateway issue, and just like for generations, African American voters have not listened to a Republican message because they don't believe the messenger, going back to 1964. So the Hispanics have decided, a lot of them have decided that I don't care what Republicans have to say about taxes and spending and national security or abortion or whatever, because I think they think that I'm a second-class citizen. And you see this spillover to Asians, et cetera. I don't think that one standard bearer can fix that, and the reason why is you look at the data of Bush in 2000 got about 35% of the Hispanic vote. Border state governor who was a active proponent of comprehensive immigration reform. He did better in 2004, somewhere between 40 and 45% of the vote. John McCain had the exact same position as Bush on immigration and talked about it in the exact same way and was from a border state and had credibility on the issue, and he got 31%. Well, what happened? The brand changed, and it was the Tom Tancredos of the world, the governors and states. It was the congressional immigration debate in 2005, 2006. The way that a Republican presidential nominee can do better among Hispanics is not just if a bill passes Congress, it's if these state legislatures that the Republicans have taken control of and these governors, that when they get the Arizona-style bill that comes through their legislature, how do they handle it in the next two legislative sessions? You got to change the brand so that we can actually speak to them about other issues that can matter. So I don't think that one standard bearer can fix that.
Yeah, I think Republicans are in desperate need of a Republican leadership conference or something. You know, the Democrats had that, you know, after the losses in the 1980s that we talked about, and you know, and it wasn't just Bill Clinton. I mean, it was Bill Clinton, it was Al Gore, even back then it was Dick Gephardt, but people don't think of Dick Gephardt as a moderate anymore. But there were a whole slew of Democrats who were from the center part of the country, center and south, who really sort of fought back against the brand of the Democratic Party that had been built over the 20 years prior and created this new kind of core. And even when Kellyanne talked about, you know, likability, and I agree with her, I think the real contest in presidential politics is about leadership. And I think leadership is much softer in how it's kind of laid out than issues. People always talk about issues, and I think this was the fundamental mistake that Mitt Romney made, was that he ran an issue-based campaign on the economy for so long, and he didn't really talk about himself. He never presented himself as a leader. He didn't really have the compassion or strength, empathy, vision, the things that people sort of look for. They're looking for somebody who's going to, you know, take care of the fears they have and also help them achieve the hopes that they have. And ultimately, those are the things that people are looking for. They're looking for a candidate. And different demographics all are looking for somebody who they can relate to, they feel this connection to. And so I think we're right here that it's not going to be maybe an individual, but remember, George Bush sort of ran against his party. People are looking for, part of that leadership is they want somebody who is going to be, they don't mind you being aligned with sort of the wingers in your party, but you can't really be a captive of them. And I kept looking throughout the entire Romney campaign, I kept looking for Mitt Romney one day to either stand up and say to some of his wealthy friends, listen, we're all going to have to get in this together. I know that, you know, we all, you know, we may have our positions, but we're going to have to pay a little bit more or do a little bit more or something. Or look at the Tea Party folks and say, I know that you're angry. I know that this is a problem, but here's what we're going to have to do. I just don't agree with you on that issue. Rick Santorum, I don't agree with you that wanting every kid to go to college is snobbery. But instead, Mitt Romney got up, and I went to Iowa and I heard him say this. He would get up and talk to these audiences and say, it's time for us to take back America. It's time for us to go back. Barack Obama thinks America has to change to become great. I want us to go back to what we were that always made America great. And I think the fundamental contest for the Republicans versus the Democrats right now, there's a mandate in this election. It's about those people who believe that we're all in this together, regardless of our skin color, our gender, love, relationships, whatever it is. We're all in this together versus people who think it's sort of, we're going to exclude people from the opportunities of America. There are people who think like, we ought to go back to a time when Harriet was in Ozzy's kitchen, and Gilligan was on the island, and Rock Hudson was in the closet, and Lucy and Desi were the only interracial couple that people allowed in polite society. But that's not the America that I think most people in the country are looking for. And so you're going to need a Republican who can kind of capture this. We're all in this together, and here are my conservative ways to achieve what we want to achieve together. Versus, I think, the brand of conservatism that we've heard really since the McCain election, and going into it got even more extreme during the Romney election, which is that we're not all in this together. Some people don't really belong in the coalition.
Kellyanne wanted to jump in. So, go ahead, Trende.
I went first last time. I can go last.
You asked, should the Republican Party be looking for a Bill Clinton? The Clinton model would be attractive to me insofar as he was from way outside of Washington. And that actually is very attractive to voters. In the previous panel, I heard a lot of sort of beltway types being mentioned as top of the ticket attractors for next time. And I'm not sure that the average voter will agree, because what will somebody from Washington really have to show for it? Gee, you stood in the way of this, or you were part of that, or nothing got done and you were part of the nothing burger. But we're all looking at the 30 Republican governors, many of whom, if not most of whom, have state legislatures to help them do these real laboratories for reformers, they're called, do some big things and some meaningful things, and work across the aisle in places where people notice whether or not you are a chief executive up to snuff. And that's still a very attractive, I think, quality of Bill Clinton in 1992. The other thing that just attracts me personally to the Clinton model is not that he was moderate, but that he tried to modernize his party, because I believe the Republican Party doesn't need to moderate, it needs to modernize. It can't wait for the young to get old and the single to get married to find new voters. It's going to have to figure out a different way. Larry was gracious enough, and the center was gracious enough to host my friend and colleague, Democratic pollster Celinda Lake, and I when we wrote a book 6 years ago. Page 25 of that book talked about the new political get, or unmarried America. Consumer corporate America figured that out years ago. They have single portion size, they have things in the cars, and the only reason that we identified it then is because it's an even bigger growth market than Asians and Hispanics, which we also wrote about. But why is it a growth market? Because 1/3 of Hispanics are still under the age of 18. It's a very, very young population compared to our other three major races in the country. But all unmarried women are over the age of 18. So all of them are in the prospective voter population. And the Republican Party is almost afraid of them, saying, well, if they're unmarried, they must care about abortion, don't they? Well, I suspect they probably do. But with what intensity level, and to the exclusion of what other issues? And I think one of the worst things that could possibly come out of 2012 for the Republican is ceding ground on abortion, meaning allowing this word to have gone from abortion to choice to reproductive freedom, which was always weird to me. I pictured ovaries and Superman capes flying around. But now it's, quote, women's health. No, it's not. If you want to have a debate about abortion, somebody in the Republican Party should stand up and say, let's have a debate about abortion. Let's talk about Roe. It's almost 40 years old. But if you're going to talk about women's health, where's cardiovascular disease? Where's cancer? Where's obesity? Where's osteoporosis? Where's homelessness for elderly people? This is what this ceding the territory. There are many people who, on the social conservative side, who don't think that Mitt Romney lost because he was too conservative. The marriage people will tell you, gee, marriage ran 6.7% points on average ahead of Mitt Romney in the 4 states where same-sex marriage just passed, including Maryland, where I think marriage ran 12 points ahead of Romney. So I like the Clinton model in that he tried to modernize his party, as well as take it away from the fringe, liberal side. But I also like the fact that he cleaned up what I consider staph infection. And I'll say to somebody who does very well for herself, has no sour grapes here whatsoever. But the Democratic Party has traditionally, through Clinton and Obama particularly, done a much better job of bringing in new talent and new ideas and finding people from all over the country who are running great campaigns locally, or who are running a think tank and saying, would you be on our presidential campaign? The Republican Party has a bit of what I call staph infection. Let's not have the same people running the same things over and over and over again. because we'll get the same result. So we're always looking for new faces at the candidate level. We ought to be looking for, and I'm not that young anymore, so let's look for new faces a generation younger than me and bring them into the party as strategists, as consultants, as thinkers.
I've heard the modernize, not moderate mantra a few times now since the election. Governor Jindal said, I think at the RGA in Las Vegas, the same thing. And to me, that captures where I see the Republicans right now, that they're convinced that the problem is still packaging, that they had a packaging problem, and they just have to change the marketing next time around with some slight accommodation on immigration. And I'm curious, if the party loses again in 2016, is that the moment when you realize the problem isn't the packaging, but it's the actual product? I mean, when does the moment come when the party realizes it's not just the packaging, it's the product? Because it took Democrats 3 cycles to finally figure it out. Modernize, not moderate, is okay, but how do you apply that to abortion, gay marriage, immigration, taxes, entitlements? I mean, what does that actually mean? And is that sufficient?
Well, modernize to me has nothing to do with packaging. It has to do with appreciating what the reality is now. And so I've been talking, I pulled up yesterday, it was from 2002, the very first presentation I ever made on Asians and reaching out to Asians. It's 10 years old, which shows you the persuasiveness I have in the party, 0. So we'll stipulate that as a fact. My husband is half Filipino. My household is about as Asian as Graceland. So we wouldn't even qualify in what I'm talking about. But the fact is, it is absolutely ridiculous for the Republican Party to have no affirmative outreach program into Asian American and Hispanic American communities. As far as I can tell, what they do now is they take a really crappy ad in English, translate it into Spanish, and say, wow, now we have 2 crappy ads. Somebody somewhere is going to watch them, aren't they? And so modernize to me is going where, knowing A, who the voters are, B, who the voters may be and currently are not turning out, which is true across the board. We still don't have a strong turnout among any of these groups the way we can. And 3, understanding where they are. You go where people are. You don't just raise a gazillion dollars and put ads up on the air. You go to the mommy play groups and the playgrounds and the beauty parlors and the barbershops and the gyms and the grocery stores and outside the Catholic churches. You go where people are. You don't wait for them to come to you.
But Kellyanne, you still have to do.
No, that's not
That's marketing, though. That's
Right.
not changing the product.
No, marketing
That's changing
sounds
the
like those
marketing.
magic focus grouped words, which I don't like.
You still
I
have
think
to
it's delivery.
change.
I think it's messy.
You
Voters
still have to
overwhelmingly
moderate a little bit. I mean, when Bill Clinton ran in 1992, he ran on ending welfare as we know it, and he stood in front of a crowd with Jesse Jackson and had a Sister Soldier moment. At some point, you have to signal to the rest of America that you are not a captive of the people they disagree with who are in your kind of further right wing.
But hold on. There's a majority of Republican governors. We have a majority of the House of Representatives. We have a majority of state legislatures. This is
So
not.
do we.
I'm just saying that I think that there are absolutely some issues. I think that number one, I do fall in this category a little bit of that. I happen to think immigration reform is the right policy, and good policy is good politics. So therefore, we ought to do it. But we don't have to change our position on all these different issues. There is some modernization of tactics that need to happen. I mean, the number one being the campaigns that I'm as guilty of this as anybody. In the campaigns that I've been involved in, we look at voters and we say, okay, are you likely to vote? And if we don't think you're likely to vote, we don't talk to you. I mean, we don't spend resources on that. President Obama looked at those people and said, those people, if we talk to them enough, we can convince them to register, and then we can get them to go vote. They're going to vote for me. Well, that's a better way to do it. I will say it's a whole lot easier to do that when you're president or when you have a 4-year head start. Mitt Romney got the nomination in the springtime, was broke, and had to do all this in 6 months. You can't do that in 6 months. You know, you do need a little bit of an infrastructure. You know, and part of this was, the first 2 years of President Obama's term, the RNC was going down a sinking ship in terms of change needs to happen at the state parties. It needs to happen. I can make a strong argument that in today's world of how the campaign finance system works, you ought to completely change how state political parties work. I mean, they ought to be turned into a little model of how Barack Obama goes out and identifies voters. They professionalize voter registration. the Republican Party have done it. The Republican Party version of voter registration is we get the teenage Republicans and the senior citizens Republicans. We put up a booth at a state fair and say, "Come register to vote." I mean, that's what we do, and it's not a professionalized operation. So I do think that there is a big tactical change that needs to happen that helps if you dedicate resources to the infrastructure. And there are some issues, but we will no longer be is successful if all of a sudden we say, you know what, we're okay with tax increases. We're okay with $16 trillion in debt. We're okay with seeding a missile defense system over Eastern Europe. We're okay. I mean, we are who we are.
Sure.
And you should be for what you're for, and good policy is good politics. We've won a lot of elections that way. We'll win more in the
But
future.
Obama has run twice now on higher taxes for the rich, and voters apparently like that. And that cuts to the core of where the party is, though.
Mitt Romney won. If you ask people on the issues, Mitt Romney won on taxes and spending. Mitt Romney won on leadership. Mitt Romney won. The one fundamental thing that Mitt Romney lost on was caring about people like me.
But part of that was because he was defined, as one famous person said, as an out-of-touch plutocrat married to a known equestrian.
That is a very smart man who made great staffing decisions. But
part of that is because he's perceived as being captive to the wealthy because he won't give on higher taxes for the rich. Look at the Obama final ad. In the Obama final ad, he talks about making the wealthy pay a little bit more. I mean, folks overwhelmingly support that. And I guess my question for the Republicans is like, how do you reconcile that with the fact that the DNA of the party is, no, we're not going to raise taxes?
Well, I think that the DNA of the party is we're not going to raise taxes because we also recognize that there is a little bit of a problem where known facts get in the way of what we're willing to say. Barack Obama, if he was able to raise all the taxes he wants to do, it's going to address 6% of the deficit. Okay, so now what? I mean, there is a little bit of give them what they want and see what happens. Yeah. But we do happen to think that if you raise taxes on the people that employ 50% of the country, that's bad for the country.
I love what I'm hearing because this is going to help us win again in 2016.
Look. The fact of the matter is that Mitt Romney was not talking about cutting taxes for the rich.
Right.
Did we do a good job of talking about that? No, we were not talking about cutting taxes for the rich. We wanted to change the tax code. And so there is a little bit of a way that maybe we should have changed.
But in the primary, he had said that he wanted to cut taxes for the rich, and Obama came back to that over and over again because he had moved to the right to fend off the new.
Well, he did come back to that. Yes, I mean there's no doubt that Barack Obama thinks he said in the primary in 2008 hurt him in the general election in 2008. Yeah. So I mean that happens. Yeah. And look, will taxes go up a little bit on the wealthy? Probably. I mean that's probably eventually going to happen. Yeah. But that is not the reason why.
What's got to happen is core Republicans at some point have to realize that they can't have everything that they want, and they are going to have to signal to the rest of the country that they're willing to go along with things in order to build a bigger party. The same way labor unions and African Americans and other people in the women's community in the Democratic Party were so hungry to win in 1992, they were willing to elect a Southern governor from an anti-union state who wanted to end welfare and stood up against Jesse Jackson.
It didn't matter in 1992. You guys could have nominated Michael Dukakis in 1992, and he would have won because George H.W. Bush was a terrible president.
Because he lied about taxes.
The economy was going horribly.
By the way.
Raised taxes, which didn't do him any good. The Democrats said, okay, they need to go even higher because you can't get to the left of the Democratic Party on tax increases for the rich, just like I don't believe you can get to the left of the Democratic Party on immigration reform. I think that's a dead end. Look, people talk about how the Republicans won 7 of 10 elections between 52 and 88, but the question is, which of those elections were they really supposed to lose? Certainly not 1980 when the economy was collapsing. Certainly not 1984 when the economy was growing at an astronomical rate. And certainly not 1988 when it was also going great guns. And we look back at the last 5 elections. Which of those elections were the Republicans, or the last 6 elections, which of those elections were the Republicans supposed to win? Not 1992 when we had a weak incumbent with terrible economy he's running, and not in 1996 when the economy was going great guns. They should have lost in 2000, but they didn't. Not in 1994 when the economy was recovering nicely and we had a wartime president. Certainly not 2008. And quite frankly, I don't think even in 2012 when the economy was coming back, there was decent growth. Unemployment was dropping. I mean, 3 points from its peak, 2.5 points. And I think it's significant, and this is more of a devil's advocate thing than anything else, but the Republican Party ran two white guys who looked like stockbrokers who wanted to privatize Medicare, which is far more radical than anything Ronald Reagan ever proposed. I mean, he didn't touch Medicare, and he worked to shore up Social Security and raise taxes for it, and they got 48% of the vote. I mean, I think we have to have some perspective here. In addition to what we were talking about earlier about the number of governors, the number of state legislatures that are being won. I mean, you compare this to where the party was in, say, 1976, when it didn't have unified control of a single state legislature. And guys like Everett Carl Ladd were saying who was a brilliant man, saying the Democrats are the everyman's party, and there's not a single positive thing for the Republicans to see in the 1976 elections. I mean, these things change quickly. Yeah. And I'm not saying that candidates don't matter. I'm not saying issues don't matter. But the fundamentals, I personally believe, matter a whole lot more. And 2016 is going to be decided fundamentally on what the economy is doing. Now, we've been promised that I remember in 2008 people saying the Democrats hit this, they're in the sweet spot because we're hitting the trough in 2008, and by 2010 everything's going to be rearing back, and it didn't work. And we're hearing kind of the same thing now. Well, things are going to be great in 2016. Well, maybe they will, or maybe the business cycle will hit where it's supposed to hit and we'll be in a recession. I hope not, but that's going to determine the outcome of the election a lot more than if the Republicans suddenly agree that the top tax rate should be 39.5% versus 35%.
I just want to quickly interject, because now we're conflating politics and policy. Just on the policy of raising taxes, because it's very much in the news this week. In 2008, as far as I can remember, Barack Obama didn't say I'm going to raise taxes on the wealthy. He said that this time. In 2008, he said, I will not raise taxes on 95% of Americans. Right. Talk about packaging. That's a fundamentally different thing, because you listen to that and you say, well, God, I'm definitely not in the top 5%, so he must be talking to me. He's not going to raise my taxes. Now there was a little bit more latitude to say I'm going to raise, because he ran against such a rich guy who acted that way. Right. I'm going to raise, I'm going to make everybody, quote, pay their fair share. But the most 2%. Important, pardon me?
Top 2%.
Top 2%, many of whom are small business owners, believe me. But I want to tell you something about the most important polling question on this whole issue is that overwhelmingly Americans believe we have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. That's not going to go away. You can tax wealthy, middle class, poor people 6 ways to Sunday, and Americans will still believe that, in other words, Americans are on to Washington. They're on to both parties and all branches of government. The pendulum will never swing backwards. You can access the same information Barack Obama can access at the very same time. We all see the same thing at the same time. And voters know that we've got a spending problem, not a revenue problem. There was some nonpartisan estimate this week that if you go ahead with that tax increase, it would keep the government running for eight extra days. Wow. That's not very much. So in other words, let's make the running of the government cost less, which is a different construct than is government a force for good or a force for evil. But this whole thing this week about Grover Norquist and the Americans Who Tax Reform tax pledge, it's so ridiculous to make it about Grover, who is one of the most selfless people in Washington. That's saying a lot. The handful of people who get invited to go on TV and talk about breaking the pledge have never actually voted for a tax increase. And I'll be very curious to see if they do, one of whom's up for re-election in 2014 in Georgia. I'll be very curious to see if they actually vote for a tax increase. We're watching. But every time I hear somebody who's taken a pledge to not raise taxes say, I don't need to honor a pledge I made 20 years ago, I'm very grateful I'm not married to them. But if they're going to break the pledge, they ought to explain why. And they ought to have the guts to stand up and say, I'm going to break this pledge because I've been so completely useless on getting spending in control, on even touching Medicare. I won't even touch entitlements because I'm so afraid you'll put it in a 30-second ad against me. They ought to be honest as to why they want to raise taxes, because they've done nothing to control spending, nothing.
If I could just agree with Sean and Jim for a moment on a point that they raised. I mean, I said earlier, I do think 16 depends in part on if Hillary runs, because she's a unique figure in American politics and could be a very formidable candidate and take the White House for 2 more terms for the Democrats. But I think it's important to keep in mind how American politics has changed since the FDR era, where we have a shorter attention span. People don't have the sort of ingrained loyalty to either side. They aren't born with the DNR in their bassinet like they were 100 years ago. So things do change rapidly now. Look, there were books written after the 2004 election about the new permanent red America, right? I mean, Bush had
Jesus land. And,
Bush had created an enduring Republican coalition for the next 20 years, and I think there were similar things said about Democrats, previously. The pendulum does swing faster now because people's loyalties are not as deeply ingrained. So I think it is foolish to say that Democrats are going to be the majority party for a generation to come because people don't have the same devotion. But that's not to say that Hillary isn't a factor in that, and also that Republicans have to take some lessons from what has happened the last two cycles. But that's the good news, I think, for the Republicans is politics changes on a dime nowadays compared to 100 years ago.
I want to agree with you just real quick on something you said about Republicans need to change. I agree. I just don't think it's going to be on taxes because that's not where we're losing. I think that the biggest thing is that there are huge segments of the electorate, African Americans in the South, Hispanics, that the way we run our elections is during the primaries we preach to the choir in the congregation, and then we go out and we try to get the people that come to church just on Christmas and Easter, the swing voters, and we win the general election. The problem is we won those people in this election. I mean, we won the swing voters. We won the independents. The problem is there weren't enough of them. So we got to actually now go out and talk to the people that have never been to church at all. And just using the church as a metaphor. But I mean, that's and I think there are issues that we can talk to them about that and attract some of those voters. I just don't think we won on taxes.
I mean, that's important because I did want to get back to the demographic question that was on the table. And if you look at the demographics, I remember about 10 days out before the election, I had a little mini meltdown. And I called a friend of mine who was a pollster, a Democratic pollster, and I said, okay, this is after the first debate, and Mitt Romney had done very well. I thought he presented a very strong, compelling vision of leadership that clearly moved some of the national polling numbers. And I asked him, I said, so, okay, talk me down from the ledge, what's going on here? He said, listen, if you look at these national polls, take the Gallup poll, for instance, they are assuming an electorate that it is impossible will exist. The Gallup poll had an electorate that was 78% white. We haven't had a 78% white electorate like in three elections. So you have to sort of assume that the electorate will continue to become more diverse, will continue to have more women who want to have more control over their own lives and less say by their husbands, will have more, it will change in a lot of ways. And once you make that assumption, then you can go out and campaign in that new America with a compelling message. But if you are assuming that the electorate is going to look like it did 4 or 6 or 8 years ago, you're going to continue to lose.
Well, I want to...
Well, go ahead.
Just this will be brief. I mean, two things to bear in mind. 98% of the advice you hear on how the Republican Party needs to change, just like it was with the Democrats 8 years ago, is going to be self-serving, right? Libertarian Republicans just think that if we got rid of the social conservatives, everything would be great. And the Ron Paul people think we just need to get rid of those neocons and we would win. And Democrats think across the board the Republicans need to position themselves about where the New Democrats were, and they're going to be great. You know, what I think you need to listen for is the person who says, I hate all these policies, but this is what the Republican Party needs to do, because everyone tends to think the parties just need to be remade in their own images, and everything will be wonderful. Briefly on the demographics, because I think this is a big point. 78% white hasn't happened since 2010. And there was this
presidentials
debate.
are different than congressionals.
But that's the question. I mean, if the African American turnout rate drops to where it was in 2004, the traditional 10 to 11%, Republicans get 90% of the African American, or get 10% of the African American vote instead of 5%. You can go back and reverse engineer the exit polls. If everything else were to stay the same as 2012, Florida and Ohio would have flipped, and Pennsylvania would have been 3/4 of a point away from giving Mitt Romney electoral vote number 270. But the bigger point is that, look, turnout was down 2 million votes, probably once all the votes are counted from 2008. And the white share of the vote dropped from 74% to 72%. The math there is pretty simple, okay? It's not that there was this big surge in minority voting from 2008. About 4 to 5 million white voters who didn't vote, or who voted in 2008, didn't turn out this time. I mean, Ohio turnout in 2012 was lower than it was in 2004. And so I just don't agree that we're going to necessarily see a 71 or 70% white electorate in 2016. If African American turnout drops to the traditional 10, 11, even 12%, if those 5 million white voters, to say nothing of the additional 2.5 million white voters who've come of voting age since 2008, turn out, yeah, I think you could see a bump up in the short term.
Are you predicting that the white electorate percentage will stay the same or go up from this year?
I'm not predicting anything. I'm saying you have to think probabilistically about.
But look at
these
the
things.
trend line of the last 5 elections.
Well, yeah. But look at what happened in 1992 when it bumped out. I mean, the trend line is the trend line from 72. In 1992, it goes up, and then it drops down again. And there are specific reasons why the white share dropped 6 points in 8 years when the white share of the population didn't drop 6 points in 8 years. And so there could absolutely be a flattening or a kickback come 2016. I think long term, if we're
you
talking,
should assume his numbers.
If we're talking,
help
don't
you.
assume anything. No, look, I'm not saying assume anything, but you shouldn't assume necessarily that things are going to drop either, because there's a counter argument out there. There are facts on the ground that are just facts. That if things play out a certain way, no, we don't see another drop in 2016. And so when you're kind of trying to build your projections, you have to put a percentage on those certain facts coming together. Nothing's guaranteed.
Well, I'm from Mississippi, went to school obviously in Virginia. I'm son of the South. I think there's two other points you have to think about here. One, if that happens, we'll probably win. I don't want to count on that. Second, everybody in this election has been, a lot of people after the election have been talking about Hispanics. It's the African American aspect that is more concerning to me, because I think there's a solution to the Republican Party with Hispanics, because we have a recent history of doing better, and I think there's, like I said before, there's a gateway issue on immigration reform, and governors need to talk about it different, et cetera. The bigger problem is that in the South you're seeing an increasingly all-black Democratic Party and an all-white Republican Party. That's bad for governing. That's bad for policy, and ultimately it's bad for Democrats politically right now. I mean, all you have to do is look at a map. Ultimately, it's going to be bad for Republicans politically. There's the percentage of the population under 18 in the state of Mississippi that's black is over 50%. So if you extrapolate that out a few years from now, Mississippi is not an all-red state. And so that's bad politically, but it's also bad for governing when you have every decision inherently, even if it's not a racial issue, every decision inherently will ultimately become a racial issue if one party's all black and one party's all white. That's bad. So there are people that the people that stopped listening to Republicans because of 1964, et cetera, well, they're dying. I mean, just to be ugly about it, there's a younger black middle class that is more open to voting for a Republican if people talk to them when it's not an election year, and it takes a multi-year institutional infrastructure effort, which is my argument about why state parties need to change the way they operate to identify those people, go talk to them in the non-election years, and that ultimately will help the Republican Party in presidential elections, state elections, and by the way, it'll be good for governing, good for policy. That's where I think the Republican Party does have a big tent, but as Haley says, we have a very small door right now, and we just need to open up the door to that tent, and things will work out a little bit better, both for policy and for politics.
Let me jump in here real quick with one final kind of global question, and then I want to open it up to the crowd to ask questions. And I want to touch on something that I think Kellyanne and also John brought up, and that is that there aren't a lot of persuadable voters out there, as is sort of shown in polling. I think it's probably safe to say that at least in the past 4 presidential elections, you've sort of had at least 45% floor for Democrats, a 45% floor for Republicans. Maybe it's even higher than that, and then maybe you have 5 to 10% of the voters being persuadable. It wasn't always like that in the United States. I mean, we had big landslides, obviously for LBJ in 64, and then for Nixon in 72. And I was wondering if you had any of the panelists had any thoughts on, are we stuck with this sort of polarized, sort of trench warfare American politics, or are there signs that maybe, it may be opening up to where presidential candidates can maybe win bigger victories than they have in the past 4 presidential elections?
We haven't had an election where we've had 3 or 4% growth in a long time. I mean, we haven't had 3 or 4% growth in a long time, period, which is a huge problem for the country. I mean, the long-term trend line in economic growth in this country is down, and what we see right now really might be the new normal, which is very, very depressing. I'm kind of bearish on the economy these days, in case you hadn't picked up, and a little bummed about it. But look, I think that if Hillary Clinton wins in 2016, and then we hit 2020 and we're having like FDR in 1936 was having 7% growth. Like if she has that in 2020, she's not going to win 52, 53% of the vote. It'll be 57, 58%. It's just, look, things have turned out almost exactly like the fundamentals would predict. You can go 2 or 3 points higher or 2 or 3 points lower, but things have turned out like the fundamentals of the election would predict for the past 50 to 60 years. There are only 1 or 2 elections that you can kind of say, well, that probably should have gone the other way. And I don't see that changing in the near future. When it does change, that's when we'll know that the demographics have really become a problem for the Republican Party. But look, the fundamentals on the economy in 2010 suggested that Republicans should pick up about 20 to 30 seats. And if you want to build in the fact that Democrats had a lot of vulnerable seats in 2010, it's probably more. They should have picked up 40. They picked up 63 seats. If the demographics were really overwhelming the Republican Party that heavily, or if we were really constrained in trench warfare, we shouldn't have had a year like 2010. And the flip side is true in 2006, where the Democrats overwhelmed what the not massively, but did better than what the fundamentals would project. So I think, given certain contingencies, yeah, we could see something big like that happen.
I think we've seen electoral college landslides, but I don't think we've seen kind of a popular vote landslide in a long time. This president's election, I guess in 2008, was one of the bigger popular vote numbers that we've seen. I think candidates do matter, and one of the candidates on the Republican side that I think for a Democrat makes me nervous is someone like a Jeb Bush. And the one thing about the Bush family is, regardless of all of their policy differences that I may have, is they present a picture to the United States of a good set of people who really care about the country and are trying to do the right thing, even though I may disagree with what they're doing. And if you think about what George Bush did when he ran in 2000, he ran sort of against the Republican Party a little bit, a compassionate conservative. He had a team of advisors around him that sort of bespoke kind of the melange of America, Condi Rice and Karen Hughes and Alberto Gonzales and kind of, Colin Powell came and endorsed him. So he presented this picture of an inclusive person, even if his policies maybe didn't evidence themselves the same way. The picture he presented to the country was good. And I think if you get a Jeb Bush who's got a strong record, with Latinos in Florida and is willing to go out there and kind of talk about in America we're all in this together and can offer some conservative policies to get there, I think he can have a pretty strong chance against a Democrat.
I like Jeb Bush too. I think that in terms of a landslide, which I guess is the original question, if Obama couldn't win by more than, what did he win in 2008? 6 points?
6.5.
Half this time.
Yeah, if he couldn't win by more than 6 points in 2008, that's really hard to imagine. I think, as Jonathan said earlier, a better situation for the Democrats. 2008 was an awful situation for the Republicans, and he only won by 6. And that's, a landslide is Ronald Reagan in 84. A landslide is Richard Nixon in 72. A landslide is Lyndon Johnson in 64. A 6-point win for Barack Obama in 2008 wasn't a landslide, and it really should have been. So in the near future, at least, it's hard to imagine a landslide situation. Although the Electoral College in 2012 looked big, this was a 325,000 vote difference between Mitt Romney Electoral College victory. I think that the thing about 2012 is it was a pretty close presidential election, and in the Senate we had some pretty awful candidates. So that if that wasn't, if a couple little things were different, we would be having an entirely different discussion up here. So I have a hard time thinking it's going to be a big landslide in the future.
It could be a big landslide in 2014, which is the year I'm really focused on now, because those midterm elections, where they are a referendum on whoever the president is, George W. Bush suffered significant losses in 2006, 6 years in as well. And the same can happen here. You've got 33 Senate seats in play. 20 are being defended by the Democrats, 13 by the Republicans. If Republicans could win 6 of the 7. They need to win 6 seats. If they win 6 of the 7 states that were carried by Mitt Romney this time, West Virginia, Louisiana, Montana, North Carolina, South Dakota, Alaska, Arkansas, they'll get control of the Senate. And that's the kind of landslide, quote unquote, I think that would either make or break the case for Republicans that they improved upon the modernization, by which I mean the delivery system, not the delivery style. I'm not a big fan of, put a woman up there because women will vote for her. Really? Ask Sarah Palin and Hillary Clinton and Geraldine Ferraro how that goes. And so it's not, delivery is not about style, it's about systems. It's, are you going to go where people are? They are technologically sophisticated now. They want it delivered to them. They want their door knocked. They want to be touched as voters, and I don't blame them. They deserve it. So I think that the party that does a better job of that at this point forward, and I've seen all kinds of articles already where the Obama grassroots machine, and indeed it is going to continue that, not to just hand it off to the nominee in 2016, but to try to help push his agenda through over the next 4 years as well, really bank on those voters to help him with his mandate and get that through as he sees it. And that's the kind of thing, without that, I don't know that it really matters who the messenger is in 2016, because the messages will stay the same. I think the messages will remain polarized. Will the messengers look any differently for either party, and will the delivery system, not style, will the delivery system improve? I actually think in 2016 the Republican nominee will be somebody that we're not even thinking about right now. That would be a good thing. In most major polls after the election in 2004, when asked which Democrat would you like to run next time, Barack Obama's name was excluded. We have 2 such national polls, media polls, that I carry around with me to show that he was excluded. There were names on there that you would say, really, at this point? And here he is, a 2-term president. So voters have a funny way of sometimes repeating history and sometimes making it. And that would be good for the Republican Party. I think it's going to be a white male governor as the nominee, and somebody like Susana Martinez out of New Mexico, and I put her out there because she's not a client. Nobody's mentioned her name today. They mentioned Marco Rubio. The other person to keep your eye on is Ted Cruz, newly elected, very conservative, beat the lieutenant governor and the Texas machine down there in the runoff. He's a new senator from Texas. He's got a great biography, obviously is Hispanic. And and is just a smart guy, as argued before the United States Supreme Court some 30 plus times.
He outflanked that noted moderate Rick Perry in Texas.
That's right. Who was called heartless over, or who thinks on immigration. Newt, my former client, on immigration said what? What are we doing with these grandmothers who've been here for 30 years?
And he caught hell for it, too.
He caught hell for it, and Rick Perry told me that he thinks he lost the primary not over oops, but over saying that people who didn't want some kind of immigration reform were heartless. So there we are.
There's no question that in midterm elections, I think Sean mentioned 6 and 10, you've seen some pretty wild swings. And I do subscribe to the fact that voters are more free agents now. And they're willing to support either side. But I do think in presidential cycles, when you get more voters coming out, it's harder to see an 84-style 49-state landslide in this era. I think you could get somewhere beyond what Obama did in 2008, especially if the scenario that Sean mentioned, which is Hillary wins in 60 and has a booming economy at her back in 20, I think she could do really well in 2020. It's a long time from now. But this is a Sabato panel, so we can do that kind of stuff. Right. But, I mean, it's hard to see a Republican carrying Rhode Island and a Democrat carrying Wyoming, isn't it? I mean, it's possible, but I think it's still it's tough given where the country is in presidential turnout years.
Does anyone in the crowd have a question?
My name is Drusy Anderson. I'm from McLean, Virginia, sometimes affectionately referred to as the Florida of Fairfax County.
The heartland, I call it.
My husband's class is 74, same graduating class as Larry Sabato and George Allen. I've always thought it took a strong man to sit in class between the two of them. I'd like to ask Jim Perry and others who might want to answer this, did the first debate matter? Do debates matter? Because it seemed like a signature moment, but for those of us that read the 538 blog, numbers really didn't change. So I'd just like to ask you what you thought.
First of all, I've been lucky enough to have some pretty exciting moments in politics, but I've never been as excited or ginned up as I was in our little war room in Denver after the first debate. Personally, it was a great moment. I do think that the first debate mattered, and the reason why is that September was a really bad month for Governor Romney. We had the Democrats had a pretty good convention. We had the 47% video. There was a sense of I think among a lot of Republicans out in the hinterlands, and even not in the hinterlands, being D.C., that this could get ugly. And the first debate changed that. I mean, I would bet that Jamal was saying to probably in the third, fourth week of September, things are looking pretty good. And he said a little bit ago, after the first debate, he had to call somebody to make himself feel better. I mean, you had a week after the first debate. I think there was 10 or 13 days between the first and second debate. You had a week where the President of the United States was running around talking about Big Bird and was having to apologize for not preparing well. And it was a really bad several days. And the numbers did change. I mean, the 538 blog has its own model, but the numbers did tighten, and part of it was Republicans started feeling better about it, and a lot of independents started saying, okay, I'm gonna give Romney a chance. And the summertime, President Obama and his team said a long time ago, early in the primary process, that their strategy was to kill Romney, and they did a really good job of that. Yeah. I mean, they did a really good job of that in the summertime, and they planted him as a known plutocrat married to a well-known equestrian, and so the people turned into the debate and said, okay, he's not that bad. He's not that, and so I think it made the race a race, frankly, and for the scope and size of the victory of the debate, made it such. The second and third debates were probably more like what we were more used to at the debates, where Republicans think their guy won, Democrats thought their guy won, and things probably didn't change a whole lot. The second debate could have been better for the Republicans if Candy Crowley hadn't, I think, inappropriately put her finger on the scale in an incorrect manner.
I'm telling the truth.
She didn't, though. I mean, the president got away with the definition of what the meaning of the word is on that statement. I mean, the discussion on Benghazi, he was blatantly incorrect on, and Candy Crowley put her finger on the scale. I think that debate could have had more of an impact than it did, but it didn't. But I think the first debate certainly mattered.
I think we take our next question.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts for you folks, all of you. First of all, I would point out that the day after, in 2008, that Obama was elected, declared the winner, first thing out of the gate is Mitch McConnell. Our one job is to make this man a one-term president.
That's not correct.
Wasn't it? Well, no, it was very soon thereafter.
2010.
It was 2 years later,
Was
and the rest of this.
2010,
Yeah, it was 2 years later.
It was trillions of dollars of spending in Obamacare later.
Yeah.
Okay, I stand corrected. I thought it was much sooner than that. The other thing, Mr. Martin here mentioned that the Republican effort in voter registration was teenagers and grandmothers.
That was me.
Was that you? That was in the wrong direction.
The handsome one.
It's the other white guy.
Actually, are kind of similar in looks from over there.
Jonathan's a good-looking guy.
But now, there were two incidents, one right here in Virginia, and I know there was also one in Florida where the Republican Party had hired professional voter registrars, attempts at voter registration, and both times there were incidences where they were caught throwing away completed registration forms. Why, I don't know.
I think those people are being prosecuted.
Pardon?
Wasn't that the same firm?
Oh, I think they're being, but whatever, they were hired by the Republican Party to do it. Now, to throw them away, no. But they did hire professionals to attempt to do it. And there was the statement that there was no attempt on Romney's part to make a reduction in taxes, but I believe towards the end that I heard it being stated, we would cut taxes by 20% across the board. So there was an effort to use that.
Well, there's let's put all the facts on the table. there's a second part to that sentence. He said, yes, cut rates 20%, and for the higher, and we're going to reduce deductions such that the higher income earners as a class would pay the same. There would be individuals that would pay less, there'd be individuals that pay more. Frankly, the people that would be paying the most would be Mormons because they give a lot to charity. So there is he wanted a more efficient, streamlined tax code that would stimulate economic growth. But that was his position. Disagree with it.
Of a 20% tax.
Yes, that's the first part of the sentence, and the second part of the sentence is.
Arguing whether who would pay more, but there was the statement of 20%.
Yes,
tax
I'm
cut.
just yes.
That's my point.
But the second part of the sentence is
Okay.
that a 20% tax cut combined with. I mean, it's like saying. You have to look at the entire plan and not just pull out one part of it. That was the Tax Policy Center's President Obama's approach at looking at it, but it didn't look at the entire plan.
Yeah, well, we could argue that, but I'm sticking to the point. There was a suggestion of a 20% tax cut. And, yeah, maybe it wouldn't result in certain groups paying less taxes, but the statement was made there was no suggestion of that, and there was. Now, you can justify
I'm not denying that. I'm saying that the rest of the plan was that there was deductions.
The other question I had about, in this Grover Norquist and the idea that a congressman should be making a pledge to an individual, and it's like, when you take your oath.
Have you read the pledge?
Pardon?
It's not to the individual. It says
Well,
to
he
the
says
vote. It
it's
says
to
to the voters of my. You have to read the pledge.
But
It's
he
really
claims
small.
the
It
pledge
fits in a
to me,
30-second soundbite.
and they're signing his pledge.
No, it's called the Americans for Tax Reform
Okay,
Pledge. Stop watching
okay.
TV
But-
when you can just pull up the pledge.
But
I'll pull
he's
it up
the
right
spokesman
here.
for that.
I'll pull it up right here.
Anyhow,
you can read it.
I personally have an issue with this
Then
kind
tell
of
the member
idea.
of Congress.
Yeah, well, that's right. And so,
Uh,
anyway.
Thank you, sir. I want to move on to the next questioner. Oh, sorry, over there. Sorry.
Okay. Hi. I want to know a little bit about what you guys think is going to happen maybe within the upcoming gubernatorial election, both in Virginia and New Jersey. They've had talk about trying to get access to Obama's, grassroots machine, and what both, if that's possible on the state level, and also what the talk that I've heard about is obviously the Democratic candidates, but do you think that the Republican candidates, both, in Virginia and New Jersey, are going to be able to kind of do the same thing and emulate what Obama has been doing on the national scale and the state level?
There was a story in the Post, I think it was last week, about the McAuliffe campaign, Terry McAuliffe running for governor next year in Virginia, trying to get a hold of the Obama list / mechanism. So I think he'll certainly try, and I assume that whoever is the nominee in Jersey will as well. The Virginia campaign, and I say this partly because I'm from here, but also it is just going to be a fascinating campaign next year. You've got two candidates now, Ken Cuccinelli and Terry McAuliffe, who fairly polarizing figures. I'm really interested. Is Larry here somewhere? Larry made this point earlier, but is it a third person going to jump in this race? If not for one of the two parties to try to run as a independent, it's going to be really fascinating between now and June or whenever the filing deadline is to see if somebody is tempted to get in and run. I also want to say thank you. I got to run because I have a flight to catch back in D.C., but thank you all very much for having me here today. So
Good to see
thank
you. Chris Christie has the highest approval rating right now ever recorded in the Quinnipiac poll. As of this week, 77%. It includes 52% of Democrats. And it just shows you what one event can do to somebody standing vis-a-vis his or her own voters. Contrast that with all the flack Christie, my governor, I live in New Jersey, Christie is taking from some of the Republican cognoscente for bear-hugging President Obama after Hurricane Sandy. And that just shows you the difference between your actual voters, the lens through which they will judge you as a leader, a chief executive, either competent or incompetent, either deserving or undeserving of a second term. But I think Christie will have, I think both states will have all the king's horses, all the king's men, all the money, and all the national political apparatus, because they are the two signature marquee races. And if I were the Democrats, I definitely would step up my game in those two states, because those were the first big warning shots of what was going to happen in 2010 when Governor McDonnell here and Governor Christie there won by double digits, and won independents whom Obama had just won a year earlier by double digits. And then you had Scott Brown winning the next month or 2 months later in Massachusetts, and then 2010 happened. So I think you will see that as a little bit of a trying to implement what happened in 2008 in those states, but also trying to preview what could happen in 2014.
But will you see the personalization of like trying to contact voters like we saw in the Obama campaign that Romney couldn't really emulate but tried very hard to? Will we see that on the state level?
Well, I certainly hope so for the Republicans. And if anybody can sort of administer that sort of, touch the voter, it's Christie. Yeah. And I wouldn't underestimate Ken Cuccinelli either. I mean, there's a boldness involved in taking on and being the first person to take on Obamacare when Obama was very popular when it happened. The other thing is this is going to be a big test case of whether the Eliot Spitzer, Andrew Cuomo, Dick Blumenthal model of an attorney general, suing state industries and going after Wall Street or drug companies or tobacco manufacturers, or is that still the big model, or is the model the Ken Cuccinelli model of attorney general, which others are following now across the country, which is to challenge the size and scope and reach of the federal government?
I think I think the candidate you're actually most likely to see that type of outreach from is Cuccinelli. He is probably he is more in touch with the Republican grassroots in the state than I think McAuliffe is with the Democratic grassroots. I mean, I personally think it's a very depressing election. But I think you have a situation where the Democratic base doesn't particularly like McAuliffe. You have a situation where the Republican base, is going to be ecstatic about Cuccinelli, and I think it's going to make a fascinating dynamic. I think turnout will be down from where it was in 2009, but I think that'll actually help Cuccinelli.
If there are other questions, feel free to come up to the lectern, but we got to end it here. But I want to thank our panelists and thank you all for staying around.
Folks, if we could ask you, you can take a stretch break, but we're going to try to make this a short break so we can keep lunch on time, okay? So just a stretch break, and then we'll get underway as soon as we can set up the computer for the presentation by Mr. Bush.